Hey Ganesh, so it looks like we have a new form of Linux malware, Symbiote, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Let's talk a little bit about it.
Yeah, that's true. Thanks, George. You discussed a little bit with me also the different tactics. Uh, there's a lot of complexity and lots of things involved with this specific malware in the sense the way it hides itself, how to make sure it stays on the under the radar for a long time. And there are also different techniques it used to basically, hide itself. You wanted to talk about a couple of aspects it wanted to hide itself. For example, there are three methods using the BPF filter. If you could explain like a little bit about BPF and other stuff, probably we can pivot from the network perspective, how to show if there is some activities happening on the networks.
What's interesting about this malware is it's trying to hide its tracks from a network perspective. It also tries to hide itself from a process perspective and a file. So any files that are executed, any processes that are run, it's trying to hide its tracks from a forensics point of view. The way this malware behaves is not like an executable per se. It's like more like a library, and this library kind of injects itself into all processes running on that machine, which gives it control over a lot of those processes, why it's so hard to be caught. But specifically what the researcher discovered in the sample is, packet capture, Wireshark, T-Shark, these are forensic methods of capturing network data to see what is going on, like what this machine is doing from a network perspective. And it's one of the many tools that's used, that we use, that everybody uses in order to see how that machine forensically was communicating outside. So the Berkeley packet filter that you were just talking about is a pretty common library that's used. And what it does is it kind of allows, it provides like an interface between an application, so in this case Wireshark, and the raw data link layer on the box. And this packet filter is kind of an in-between between the tool, so Wireshark, and what's happening on the box. And it allows the person performing the analysis to filter out certain protocols, certain, entries, whether it be domains, IPs, whatever, and in this case, the malware is using this filter to inject itself and filter out a series of ports, the source and destination ports, that it does not want the researcher or the analyst to see. The ports you're going to provide, you're going to show us pretty soon, are some that were captured in this sample that the researcher chose. And what happens is, as soon as the application senses that Wireshark or some kind of packet capture application is being run, this library kicks in and says, okay, it goes through the list of packets, and it analyzes the traffic, and it tries to find this specific list of ports that it has already, in the malware. And if it finds that list, if it finds that specific port, it's going to filter that out so that when you run your packet capture, you will not see it. It will not pass it on to the application layer, right? So you're not going to see it in your report. And it works for inbound and outbound traffic. To not repeat myself, that's pretty much what it's doing, right? It's just going to filter out these certain ports. This is from a TCP perspective. There's also another method they use for UDP. We'll go into that after. But yeah, I'll hand it back to you, Ganesh, to discuss some of these ports that they're filtering out, including some hidden ports that were seen to be used by the malware.
Excellent. Thanks, George, for the little intro and giving a little background on what type of malware and what methods it's used. The first and foremost, you mentioned about the shared objects. I think that gives the entire access to the malware, right? I believe that's also one of the goals, to stay hidden and brute forcing for exfiltration for passwords. I think that's the main goal. As you mentioned, there are a couple of ways actually this malware tries to stay hidden by manipulating BPF, is basically a Berkeley packet filter, and also use of eBPF is extended version of BPF. The only difference is eBPF gives the user land processes. For example, there's a root user which has higher privileges, right? And the regular users with a little bit limited privileges. With the EBF, what gives the user is to run some of the processes from the user land in the kernel itself. That means there's basically there itself a little bit of elevation of privilege. The reason it's being done is the faster response, and also basically the side effects of it is it also probably provides some avenues elevation of privileges. That being said, coming to your point, how the BPF, which is a packet filter, it's analogous to IP tables in different Unix flavors. Basically, it's a creation of various firewalls rules, right? You allow some ports, you deny some ports. Basically, it goes by line by line. In this case, I believe the first method which you talked about is whenever the application tries to open the application ProcNet TCP. Like you mentioned, it's specifically related to TCP. With respect to TCP, that's where actually whenever a calling process is trying to access ProcNet and TCP, which is basically processes under network, under TCP category, it tries to inject itself with a bytecode. The bytecode itself, I think there are 3 or 4 methods actually set up firewall rules it's trying to see. What it does is whenever actually this process has been called, it first of all creates a temporary file and copies the very first line from the ProcNet TCP into the temporary file. And afterwards, it kind of goes through the list through the ProcNet TCP to see if it's able to see any of the ports of interest, maybe protocols of interest. If it finds that, it skips that, it goes to the next one. Whichever not there, basically it populates in the temp file. I think that's how it's trying to manipulate this application process table, and that it provides to the user, maybe admin, whoever is basically invoked this process. That being said, little segue into what kind of firewall rules, BPF rules being used by Symbiote. There are 4 variations. The first one is IPv6. You mentioned like IP related. In this scenario, I believe it's taking care of version 6 as well as the traditional v4. So I'll explain briefly about the first sentence, right? IPv6 TCP or SCTP. In this case, it doesn't matter if it is TCP or SCTP. If that matches that rule as a protocol, and it also looks for the source ports of any of these ports. Like in this scenario, 43253, 43753, 63424, or 26424, right? That's one combination of the rule. And another rule would be basically with the same IPv6, but specific to one port only, 43253. And again, similar set like with respect to IPv4, again, source and destination ports. These are the rules basically it tries to see. These are the ports actually it tries to don't show it to the user. I think that's how it's trying to hide itself. So in the next few graphs, what we were showing is there any activity happened or maybe any anomalous behavior, something happened on these ports we can glean, maybe can give some different indicators, additional indicators from the research itself. So before going, if you may, George, I want to just touch base with what is SCTP. Like just a little intro is basically it's a stream control transmission protocol. How is it different from TCP? It's basically it provides full duplex. In that sense, it gives much more actually control than TCP. We know TCP is 3-way handshake. I think in the SCTP, one of the features is a 4-way handshake happens. But these are some of the different aspects which are greater than which are better than TCP. I think it provides a secure data transports, multi-streaming and multi-homing. I think this is where SCTP actually shines compared to TCP. For example, in our home routers or something, with multi-streaming is much more better than the TCP, right? You're having only one stream. And obviously there's reliable data transfer, partial data transfer. These are not the extensive list, but these are some of the things which came to my mind. I thought maybe just list it down to just make the difference between TCP and SCTP.
Yeah, no, I think these five are perfect. Multi-homing, multi-streaming. The fact that they also use DNS for data exfil may also play a role in this. But yeah, no, you've explained it perfectly. So it's important to understand why they want to use this as well as TCP.
Okay, thank you. Moving on, let's start with the first set. Here we're looking at the source ports. As again, actually x-axis is basically listing what sources we are looking at as a port number. And the y-axis is the volume. In this case, we are looking at the flow counts per hour. So when you look at the timeline, actually I started from end of October last year. There's a reason for that one. I think the malware activity has been observed, I think start of November. I went a few days before that to see is there any trend or maybe some behavior we can pick it up. As you can see, I mean, the volumes are not much. There's a couple spikes. One of the spikes, basically, sometimes it varied. Some of the quick checks with the reports available for some of them seems to be scanning activity. I mean, there's nothing indicating, basically, I think a scanner scanning for these ports and nothing else. And as we see in the subsequent graphs, in this case, basically similar to the volume, in this case, we are looking for scan flows is nothing but basically how the scanning activity is occurring. If, for example, there's a widespread scanning happening, is there anything we can pick it up? That's one of the reasons you see only few spikes here and there. That indicates that scanning activity is limited. It's not very well widely accepted. It's not been done as widely as before. So that gives some indications. There were some spikes for one of the ports, 43753. And afterwards, there's a little ones. But more or less, actually, you see they're very dormant periods by looking at this graph, except for 63424 constantly, there is some activity. But I come back to it in the next slide. In this case, we are looking at the scanning activity and how many IPs, in this case, we say sources, scan sources are responsible for this graph scanning activity. As you can see, these are all stacked charts, right? At any point there, the sources are very small number, like one or two ones and twosies. At some point, I think when there's a huge spike, they are also well below 10, maybe 10 to 11, that's it. That indicates actually the scanning activity is not widespread, but I think there's sporadic activity happening. Apologies, I think I should have mentioned before starting it, these are all high-numbered ports and there are not any well-known ports associated with any of these ports.
Yep.
Okay, moving on. This is for the second rule set where actually it's looking for IPv6, SCP or TCP, and combination of destination port 43253. Basically, it's giving a little bit, because of one port only, we could able to see a little bit more activity. But again, the activity is very low, basically, I think very minimal. And I think there again, sometime in May, actually, there were a couple spikes. And just before that, maybe 2 months ago, another couple spikes. Again, these are all corresponded to with the latest reports, which I have seen seems to be scanning activity. I think some sort of scanners doing a specific scan. It could be possible that when a scanner does this widespread scanning, I think they're not specifically only looking for this port. They are looking for other ports also. These ports also picked up, You know what I'm trying to say. It's not specific to this port only. There's a combination of mixed scanning. So that's about 43253. Again, a similar graph showing the scan flows. Again, it's very minimal. nothing much except for the one or two big spikes. But again, the scan sources are higher at that time, which actually will be shown in the next graph. Yeah, again, you see, if you see the y-axis, the maximum number of scanner IPs are at 4. That means most of the scanners are a single source or two sources, sometimes occasionally 3, and only 2 times we have seen 4 scan sources involved. So yeah, it's pretty much probably an automated scanner. It's doing every day and nothing else. All right, yeah, moving on to the next set. Again, the same combination. In this case, I think protocol is IPv4 instead of v6, and combination of destination for any of these ports. So in the ports, it's R of any of the ports. It's not and in this case. I mean, it's the case with all the ports, I should say that. Again, expected behavior, not much activity, very, very minimal levels of activity seen with port pair spikes. I think these spikes corresponded to the source port also. I think the corresponding source and destination ports corresponded to the same time. So again, minimal activity on the scan flows also. As you can see in the next chart again, that is related to the number of scan sources increase. That's it. In this case, I believe, in this case, still the number of scan sources are hovering around 10 to 11 at the max. So it's sporadic. It's continued as expected with respect to the source ports. And moving on to another section, basically in this research, they also mentioned about some set of hidden ports, Josh. I think there are about 9 to 10 hidden ports. Again, there are not any well-known ports associated with other than they are all ephemeral high-numbered ports, right? Again, following the same trend line starting from end of October last year and seeing it, except for 45345, the activity seems to be in sync with little bit spikes here and there. So I just put it if anything can be seen different than actually BPF filters actually the malware is looking at, maybe trying to avoid it. So I think by seeing some activity, it may not be related to, but I think if we see some activity happen in the previous slides, basically from the BPF filter and maybe some combination of spike, most likely related to this activity. I think this may give some pivot points for anyone looking if they're seeing some increased activity, right? If it has been filtered out, maybe this could be another venue to see if they have some access to the common backbone. That's the whole goal. Again, it's basically flows. In this case, in this case, we are showing the combination of source and destination together as a whole volume. We are not broken down by only source, only destination. This is what this graph is. And coming to this graph, again, this is the same graph, but taking out the source direction. I think directionality is being not better directional. We are only when it is going to the destination. That's what this graph is. So the next two graphs are basically based on the destination target ports with the volume, scan volumes in this case again, and scan sets count. Again, the numbers are not huge. I think even with these ports, the max is around 14 or 15. Just try to remember, even though around this point, around I think start of March, April, there seems to be around 27, 26. But we have to keep in mind, since it's a stacked charge, each port's scan zips are actually top of another one. But in reality, I think the numbers of individual port is less than 10 or 12. So yeah, I think these are related to the ports. I'll pause here before you delve into the DNS part of the malware artifacts.
Yeah, and I think what's important is to understand the BPF filtering. I know you know a little bit more about how that functions. So from like an analysis perspective, right? When they enable this filter, so even if you were to perform some endpoint analysis to see traffic entering and exiting that endpoint that you believe is infected, would you say that the packet filter would also filter out that traffic since it works at the firewall level, essentially blocking all visibility? Or is it just when you're using like a Wireshark application or a T-Shark application from a forensics perspective?
I think it's only whenever this EBF, BPF, that has been invoked, or maybe proc TCP, it's trying to basically hide itself. It's basically rewriting, right?
Yeah,
it's creating the temp file and it's applying to the end user. So in that one, you don't see any traces of which the malware author doesn't want to see. But I think at the CPP level, network level, if there is some activity happening, technically you should be able to see. I think that's the point basically showing in the graphs.
Yeah.
Even though something is not happening, I think still we see a little bit of activity happening. And also, I believe this activity started in Brazil. Probably it's at this point actually concentrated in Brazil. Maybe our visibility also limited because of maybe it's not been targeting other parts of the world. But at least it gives an indication of the trends. Maybe this could be another pivot point besides doing a deeper analysis. Like a quick thing, you look at it, if you see something anomalous, probably dig a little bit further.
So, and I think this is pretty highly targeted, right, to the financial sectors, at least of Latin America, where they saw this, in Brazil mainly. And even some of the C2 and some of the domain names that they were scrubbing out of the packet filters, right, which I think that's going to be the next third way that they evade when they're doing the UDP packet filtering. So yeah, a lot of those domains or subdomains were Brazilian banks. And one of the C2 addresses was actually something to do with the Brazilian Intel Association. So yeah, it seems like a highly targeted malware. So even if our visibility doesn't go that far, probably wouldn't see too much. But having this kind of visibility from a network perspective gives you another pivot on trying to track this, to see if there's any kind of thing that you should be concerned about, or if you have an endpoint that you feel is possibly compromised, and have in your mind that you should be capturing network traffic, network logs, and not relying solely on, what's on the endpoint itself via, using a Wireshark packet capture, especially now that, they figured out a way to filter this out. So yeah, this provides good perspective. And the fact that it's highly targeted makes it even harder to kind of see, because you won't see like tremendous spikes, right? Because it's something that's specific to the financial side, at least now. I'm sure this is going to be morphed into different types of malware, right? And to be used many different ways. And it drops other malware on the machine as well.
That's true. I mean, basically, to that point, this is not the first malware, I believe, which try to use BPF, right? There were, I think, there are not many, but it's not novel. But I think the techniques they used should be actually of concern, maybe the pivot points. And this graph basically to support your view from the UDP point of view. I know they have one domain initially, it did not resolve probably. That's when they try to test their domain, whether it's been resolved or not. I think there are also instances, I think they submitted to VirusTotal and see. I think around this time, the passive DNS actually started resolving to a couple of name servers, like you said, some Intel-based agencies in Brazil, I believe, right? So So I took that IP and see if we could see anything from our backbone. Maybe if there's some activity, we could pick it up. As you can see, there's nothing happen until basically and like the start of February, maybe end of Jan, between that time frame. Keep in mind it's in UTC. Probably it could be start of February also. There's no activity. Suddenly there was activity started happening around February time frame. I think around this time frame only, I think the name servers were resolving, and I believe one or two name servers, but I think the IP pointed to the one IP address. So it also gives a little bit perspective, maybe anomalous behavior or something of that sort. You did not see any activity in the past so many days and suddenly started. Probably that could be an indicator. I think any activity for now, if it is going to this IP range 807822. By the way, in this case, we went up to A.B.C. That means that the last sector D has not been populated, but it gives a pretty good fair idea how the activity is happening on that network block. I believe there's also in the research they said that they saw some increased activity, maybe new pivot actually with the DNS they observed around the same time, like February timeframe. I believe that kind of matches with the graph we are seeing, and I think we could confidently say we are also seeing this activity happen on this specific IP address. Yeah, I think these are some of the charts I want to discuss with you, and so that we are aware of other pivot points. We can take a look, and besides what's provided in the research, I think these are some pivot points can be taken into consideration.
I agree. Yeah, it seems like something they would do. They would use over and over. I mean, IPs will be changing, domains will be changing, but utilizing the traffic from this angle is a great way to keep an eye out for this specific malware because it's hiding itself on the endpoint. So
yeah, I agree with you, George. I just want to say I agree with you on that aspect.
Yeah, and I guess I'll what do you say if I loop into the third method that they're using to hide their tracks from a network perspective?
Yeah, please go ahead. I also there's some hidden processes, right? To also give some indicator, please.
Oh yeah, right. The hidden processes, we'll go through that. So yeah, so the third method they're using from a network angle. So they're hooked into just about every process. So one of the functions they hooked into is the live PCAP function, right? And this live PCAP function they're using to filter out UDP traffic. We talked about TCP, we're talking about UDP now. And they're going to filter out some domain names that they have. And they already have a list on the machine, right, that the malware has that they're coming off of. So they're going to step through, they're going to loop through all of the packets looking for this list of domain names that they're using for C2, for DNS exfil, data exfil, you know, however they're going to use it. And in order for that analyst not to pick it up in a PCAP, they're using two functions. So they're looping into they're hopping on the PCAP loop function and the PCAP stats function. And these two functions work hand in hand because the PCAP loop, what it's doing is as soon as you acquire a packet capture, it's going to iterate through all of the items, you know, all of the events that it picked up, all the packets it picked up, and the amount of packets is in the PCAP stats function, right? So it's going to loop through PCAP stats times, right? So if it pulls down 100 packets, the PCAP stats number will be 100, right? And that's how it knows there are going to be 100 packets in this specific capture. So what the malware is doing, and that stats function is to make sure that it's like a checks and balance, right? To make sure that if there's 100 packets and stats only sees 98, there's an error, there's an issue there. We're missing 2 packets. What the malware is doing is going to be ignoring some of those packets. So in order for the malware to not be caught and to kind of true up to the stats function, the Symbiote is is going to look through, right, all the packets. It's going to create its own counter. It's going to have its own counter separate from the PCAP stats number. And it's going to, as it goes through the capture, it's going to look through every single packet, and it's going to check the UDP payload for some certain strings. And these are substrings from domains that it's going to match on. And if it matches on something that it has in its list, it's going to ignore that packet, right? So it's going to ignore that packet, but instead of ignoring that packet and dropping the number, it's going to increase the number in its stats file. So it has its own stats file. So it's going to increment the counter that the malware is using, right? And continue on the list, right? So instead of a number being subtracted by 1 because it's ignoring a packet, it's going to kind of try to compensate for that by incrementing its own counter by 1. Once it processes the entire capture, what it does is if there were any numbers, if there are any packets in that capture that it filtered out, it's going to take the total number from that, the total value that was in that counter and subtract it from the true number of packets that were captured. And this will allow it to line up to the PCAP stats number. This way there's no variation between the amount of packets it looked through and the amount of packets in the stats. If that makes sense. So you have the malware creates its own counter, right? And then you have the PCAP stats file. And the counter, in order to true up to this, trues up to the actual stats file so that there doesn't appear to be any error, even though in reality, it's skipping a ton of these entries, right? It's skipping a ton of packets. Let's say it finds 10 UDP packets. The number of actual packets scanned is going to true up at the end because they created this counter file that's going to kind of true up to the stats file that's supposed to do its checks and balance.
It's similar to the temp file it's creating.
Right.
Which one it is.
Yep. It creates a temp file to kind of replace the original file if there's anything. So the fact, like you said in the beginning, the fact that this operates at like the library or the user land level, and it's more like an injection of a library into a group of processes. It has higher privileges, and it could do just about anything in the OS to manipulate, any kind of checks and balances that the OS would do to catch it. And the researcher did also say that, just so that everybody knows, when they analyzed all of this that's happening, right, all of these substitution counterfiles that it's creating, everything here, none of this can be automated. A lot of this has to be written manually, and it's highly complex code. So whoever is writing this is extremely experienced in writing code and to pull this off. So it's extremely interesting, the three ways that they're hiding their tracks.
And I think I just don't want to cut you off. I know you mentioned to me there's a specific pattern with the DNS request, right? That could be an indicator, like a format, like a DNS recurve format. Like you have the packet number followed by some machine ID and some X code and followed by the domain, right? That could be like an indicator of this specific threat. Also, if you have some thoughts on whenever some sort of SSH or SCP used, I think it tries to grab some credentials, right? Is that a fair statement? Like whenever, let's say, there's a SCP is happening, maybe SSH kind of traffic is happening, it tries to capture the credentials, right? For example, when I'm SSHing and with my user ID, there will be password associated. It observes and tries to capture those user IDs, and later I think it uses that list to brute force.
Yeah. So it has a key logging feature as well, the malware.
Okay.
And that's how it's capturing your entries for the SSH connection. And yeah, it'll take that and it'll actually store it locally on the machine and kind of keep it there. and just also to use it in the future. If for some reason they lose connectivity to the box, they're hoping that by doing that, they can access the machine sometime in the future.
So yeah, as you explained, there's so many aspects actually. It can try to stay under the radar, and they went great lengths to stay hidden in that way. And like you said, this malware author seems to be well educated and well known about this, how the kernel to user land processes happen, how the packet filters work, how the counters work. It basically takes a great length of competency to build up such kind of threat.
Oh yeah, you know, and not to say that this cannot be caught or stopped for endpoints, you know, that do not have any sort of EDR, endpoint detection response, or any kind of AV. That's where the trouble is, or out of date AV. There's a lot of EDR tools out there, modern day behavior-based EDR tools that will pick up on some of this, because a lot of the EDR and AV that's out there now, it behaves this way. It injects itself into every process on the box. So it's kind of interesting to see them use a similar method as malware, when this is what tools that are used to fight malware. This is how they function. They inject themselves into all processes, and fortunately, while the indicators are not going to be good forever, there are some hashes out there that are provided in the link, you know, that BlackBerry and the researchers did, that help out. So you can look for these hashes in your environment, and these are the originating files that, you know, were either dropped on the machine or would lead to such an infection. There are also some domains and some IPs, like you were just running through, that people can use to identify if they were compromised. So if you do have a modern day EDR, which is behavior-based, not just signature-based, you know, you do have a form of protection. But, you know, this is Linux, right? And we know that the majority of Linux are being used on servers and in the cloud. And with everybody throwing everything into the cloud as quick as they can, right? Because they don't want to be paying for the big iron anymore, or data centers. Security always kind of gets a back door, right? Like, okay, we'll deploy eventually, right, to the cloud. Logistically, they haven't figured out how to deploy whatever they're using on an endpoint, on like a Windows box, right? It takes a little bit more planning. Maybe you need to do firewall, you know, punch some holes in a firewall to get out. So that's where it could be a little scary for some companies. And typically a lot of your servers are running Linux. And, you know, a lot of companies don't put heavy AV on their servers because there could be a resource issue, right? If a lot of EDR products tend to have overhead and may cause a resource issue, and to keep the server admins happy, security teams may just disable the agent altogether and say, you know what, we're just going to disable it so you can function. So that's where this becomes worrisome. So if you have EDR, focus on getting it on your Linux machines as well, because this kind of malware is going to be around and it's going to morph.